Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean. The sky above is heavy with dark clouds, the wind roars through the air, and the waves crash fiercely against the shore. In the midst of this chaos, your heart races, your mind feels unsettled, and a whirlwind of emotions threatens to pull you under. Now picture a different scene. Deep within you lies a quiet sanctuary, a place untouched by the storm outside, a calm so profound it remains steady no matter how wild the sea becomes. This sanctuary is the essence of what it means to live with an unshaken mind. To live in the world with an unshaken mind doesn't mean shutting yourself off from life or becoming indifferent to its joys and sorrows. It's not about denying hardship or pretending pain doesn't exist. Rather, it's about cultivating a deep inner steadiness, a refuge within yourself where peace endures beyond the turmoil. Life, as we know it, is unpredictable. Every day brings moments of happiness and heartbreak, success and failure, gain and loss. The world around us shifts constantly, and with it, our circumstances, our relationships, and even our own thoughts and feelings. This constant flux can feel overwhelming, as if we're caught in a storm without shelter. But what if there is a way to navigate this ever-changing landscape with grace? What if you could stand firm, like a mountain rooted deep into the earth, unmoved by passing storms? This is the promise of the unshaken mind, a mind that, through wisdom and practice, learns to hold steady in the face of life's inevitable ups and downs. This idea isn't new. It echoes through the ages, from ancient sages to modern teachers. In Buddhism, the unshaken mind is a symbol of liberation, a mind free from the chains of fear, craving, and aversion. It is a mind that sees clearly, accepts fully, and responds with calm clarity rather than reactive turmoil. So how does one find this inner sanctuary? How do we build such resilience when the world seems intent on shaking us to our core? It begins with understanding the nature of the mind itself, its tendencies, its attachments, and its potential for peace. It starts with learning to observe life without losing our center, to meet challenges without being swept away by them. Throughout this journey, we'll explore timeless teachings and practical tools that have helped countless individuals cultivate an unshaken mind. We'll delve into the realities of impermanence, the power of mindfulness, and the art of letting go. We'll discover how compassion and wisdom serve as twin pillars holding this steady ground within. This is not just a lofty ideal reserved for monks or mystics. It's a living, breathing possibility for anyone willing to explore it, a way to live fully and freely in a world that will never stop changing. As we embark on this path together, keep this image in mind. No matter how fierce the storm outside, there is a calm space within you, waiting to be uncovered, a place where your mind can remain unshaken. There is something profoundly powerful about a mind that refuses to be tossed around by the waves of life. But what exactly does it mean to have an unshaken mind? It's a question that reaches far beyond mere calmness or silence. It's a state of being where the mind is grounded in wisdom and kindness, able to face whatever arises with clarity and strength. Imagine a tree with deep roots. When storms rage, the branches may sway, leaves may fall, but the roots hold firm, keeping the tree standing tall. The unshaken mind is like those roots, deeply anchored, steady even when everything above seems uncertain. In Buddhist philosophy, this steadiness isn't about shutting down emotions or becoming cold and detached. On the contrary, it's a mind that fully acknowledges feelings, joy, anger, sorrow, fear, but doesn't let them control or overwhelm. It's a balanced mind, neither pushed nor pulled by extremes. At the heart of this balance lie two inseparable qualities: wisdom and compassion. Wisdom, or prajna, is the clear seeing of things as they truly are, the nature of reality beyond illusion. Compassion, or karuna, is the warmth and kindness that arises naturally when we understand the interconnectedness of all beings. Together, they form the foundation of the unshaken mind. Wisdom gives us insight, showing that clinging and aversion only lead to suffering. Compassion softens the hardness that sometimes builds in response to pain, opening the heart to care for ourselves and others. But how do we cultivate these qualities? It begins with mindfulness, being fully present with whatever is happening inside and outside us, without judgment. Mindfulness allows us to notice the first stirrings of agitation, fear, or desire before they take hold. It gives us a pause, a moment to choose our response rather than react blindly. Through this mindful awareness, we begin to see patterns, the habitual reactions that keep us trapped in cycles of stress and turmoil. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward freedom. The unshaken mind doesn't deny these feelings or push them away. Instead, it meets them with calm curiosity, allowing them to arise and pass without losing its center. This process is like watching clouds drift across the sky. The clouds may come and go, dark or light, but the vast sky remains untouched. Our true nature, beneath the surface of fleeting thoughts and emotions, is vast and unshakable. Yet it's important to remember that this is not a sudden transformation. The unshaken mind is cultivated gradually, like building a muscle through regular practice. Moments of peace may come and go, but with patience and perseverance, steadiness deepens. Living with an unshaken mind doesn't mean you become invincible or immune to life's challenges. It means you develop resilience, the capacity to recover quickly and maintain your balance amid chaos. It means learning to respond rather than react, to move with life's currents rather than being swept away. As we deepen our understanding of this state, we'll also explore how the world itself, with all its impermanence and change, plays a role in shaping our minds. Because to live unshaken is also to embrace the reality that nothing stays the same. Our next journey will take us into the heart of impermanence, how accepting the ever-changing nature of life can bring profound freedom and peace. But before we go there, hold on to this. The unshaken mind is not a distant goal, but a living reality you can begin to experience right now, through every breath and every moment of awareness. There's a saying in Buddhism that everything is impermanent, anicca, meaning nothing stays the same, nothing lasts forever. This truth can feel unsettling at first, like standing on shifting sand, but it's also the key to unlocking an unshaken mind. Think about the world around you. The seasons change without fail, flowers bloom and wither, morning turns to night, and people come and go in your life. On the surface, these cycles seem ordinary, even mundane. But beneath this rhythm lies a profound reality. Everything we cling to, everything we love, everything we fear will eventually change or fade away. Our minds, too, are caught in this endless flow. Thoughts arise and disappear, feelings shift from joy to sorrow and back again. We try to hold onto moments of happiness or stability, but they slip through our fingers like water. Why does this matter? Because most of our suffering comes from resisting this truth, clinging to permanence in a world that is constantly changing. When we grasp tightly to what is fleeting, whether it's possessions, relationships, or even our own identity, we set ourselves up for disappointment and pain. But here's the paradox. By truly understanding and accepting impermanence, we open the door to freedom. When we stop fighting against change and instead embrace it, we no longer need to fear loss or uncertainty. We begin to see life as a river, flowing naturally, without needing to hold on to every pebble in its path. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It's an active, wise choice to live fully in each moment without being trapped by the illusion of permanence. It allows us to appreciate beauty and joy without attachment, to face challenges without despair. Imagine a leaf falling from a tree. It doesn't struggle or cling. It simply lets go and becomes part of the earth. There is a grace in this letting go, a peaceful surrender to the natural order of things. When we internalize this truth, our minds start to loosen their tight grip on fears and desires. The waves of craving and aversion lose their power to toss us around. Instead, we find a steady ground beneath our feet, a center that remains firm even as everything else shifts. This is the heart of the unshaken mind. Not a fortress built to resist the world, but a flexible strength born from embracing impermanence. Like the bamboo that bends but does not break in the storm, we develop resilience by moving with life rather than against it. In practical terms, this means learning to observe change with curiosity and kindness, watching thoughts, emotions, and external events as they arise and pass away. It means practicing mindfulness not just as a technique, but as a way of being present with life's ebb and flow. As we continue, we'll explore how mindfulness and meditation help us cultivate this deep awareness and steady presence. These practices become the tools that anchor us to the present moment, where impermanence is no longer a threat but a source of wisdom and liberation. The world may be unpredictable and ever-changing, but through mindful practice, we discover a profound peace beneath the surface. This peace doesn't deny the storm, it stands quietly at its center. And so, the path continues, guiding us gently toward the practice itself, the cultivation of mindfulness and meditation that will help transform our understanding into lived experience. If the world is a river flowing endlessly, then mindfulness and meditation are the skillful paddles guiding us safely through its currents. They are the ancient tools that help us find steadiness amidst change, the way to nurture that unshaken mind we seek. But what exactly is mindfulness? It's more than just paying attention. Mindfulness is the art of being fully present, awake and aware of whatever is happening in this very moment without judgment or distraction. It's a gentle noticing of the breath, the body, the mind's shifting thoughts and emotions, all observed with kindness. Meditation is the dedicated practice of cultivating this awareness. It is the training ground where the mind learns to pause, to steady itself, to look deeply without getting caught up in the drama of life. Through meditation, we build the muscle of presence that carries us beyond reactive habits into a place of clarity and calm. In the beginning, meditation can feel challenging. The mind wanders, distractions arise, and impatience creeps in. But this is natural. Each time we gently bring our attention back to the present moment, we are strengthening our inner refuge, a sanctuary that no storm can penetrate. Mindfulness and meditation teach us to meet all aspects of our experience, the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral, with equanimity. Instead of running from discomfort or clinging to pleasure, we learn to hold everything with open hands, allowing life to unfold as it is. This practice transforms our relationship with ourselves and the world. We become less reactive and more responsive. Anger softens, fear loses its grip, and joy becomes deeper and more lasting because it is not tied to grasping or attachment. One of the most profound gifts of meditation is the insight into impermanence. As we watch thoughts arise and fade, emotions swell and subside, we witness firsthand the transient nature of all things. This direct experience grounds the wisdom we spoke of earlier. It's no longer just an idea, but a living reality within us. Beyond personal peace, mindfulness opens our hearts. Compassion arises naturally when we recognize our shared human experience of struggle and change. We begin to see others not as separate or opposing forces, but as fellow travelers on the same journey. In daily life, mindfulness becomes a guiding light. Whether washing dishes, walking, or facing a difficult conversation, bringing full awareness to each moment helps us stay connected to our unshaken center. It reminds us that even ordinary actions hold the potential for presence and peace. Many teachers emphasize that the path to an unshaken mind is not about escaping the world, but engaging with it fully, awake, aware, and compassionate. Mindfulness and meditation are the means by which we cultivate this engagement, transforming every breath, every step, into an act of awakening. As we move forward, we'll explore how this steady presence allows us to face life's challenges with greater resilience and wisdom. We'll uncover the art of letting go, not as loss, but as freedom, and how compassion deepens as the mind becomes unshaken. The journey is both ancient and immediate, a timeless invitation to awaken to the fullness of life exactly as it is. There is a quiet power in letting go, a strength often misunderstood. We live in a world that glorifies holding on, to possessions, to ideas, to people, even to our own identity. But the unshaken mind knows the secret that true freedom comes not from grasping, but from release. Letting go doesn't mean giving up or becoming indifferent. It means recognizing when attachment causes suffering and choosing instead to open the hand, to release the tight grip that binds us. It's a conscious act of trust, a surrender to the flow of life rather than a desperate clinging to what once was or what we wish it to be. Think about how often we hold onto grudges, regrets, or fears. These invisible chains weigh us down, cloud our minds, and keep us stuck in pain. Letting go is the practice of breaking those chains, not by forcing them loose, but by gently loosening the grip, moment by moment. In Buddhist teachings, this practice is deeply connected to the understanding of impermanence we explored earlier. When we truly see that everything changes, our emotions, relationships, even our sense of self, it becomes easier to release what no longer serves us. But letting go also requires courage. It means facing uncertainty without clinging to false securities. It means embracing the unknown with a heart open to possibility rather than closed by fear. This practice is reflected in many stories and parables, like the lotus flower that rises from muddy water, untouched by the dirt below. It doesn't fight the mud. It simply grows above it, radiant and free. So too can our minds rise above attachment and aversion, shining with clarity and peace. Letting go is not a one-time event, but a continuous journey. Each day offers countless opportunities to practice, whether it's releasing a judgment, forgiving a hurt, or stepping back from a craving. Each small act of letting go creates space for freedom, compassion, and deeper wisdom. And paradoxically, the more we let go, the more we find ourselves. Without the clutter of attachment, our true nature, open, calm, and compassionate, can emerge more fully. As we journey further, we'll explore how this unshaken mind navigates life's inevitable challenges with grace, how embracing change and practicing letting go become the foundation for resilience and joy. The path of letting go invites us to live lighter, freer, and more fully present, ready to meet whatever comes with an open heart and steady mind. As the unshaken mind grows steadier, two qualities naturally arise: compassion and wisdom. These are not separate virtues to be pursued in isolation. They are intertwined forces that deepen our understanding and enrich our experience of life. Compassion is the heart's response to suffering, our own and that of others. It is the warm, tender recognition that beneath the surface, everyone shares the same struggles, fears, and hopes. When we cultivate compassion, we open ourselves to connection rather than isolation, kindness rather than judgment. But compassion alone is not enough. Without wisdom, compassion can become overwhelmed or misguided. Wisdom, in this sense, is the clear seeing, the deep insight into the nature of reality, impermanence, and the interdependence of all things. Together, compassion and wisdom guide the unshaken mind through the complexities of life. Compassion motivates us to act with kindness and care, while wisdom helps us choose skillful means, discerning when to engage and when to step back. In Buddhist philosophy, this balance is central. The Bodhisattva, the enlightened being who chooses to stay engaged in the world for the sake of all beings, embodies this harmony perfectly. They cultivate both a boundless heart and a sharp mind. On a personal level, developing compassion softens the barriers we build around ourselves. It transforms suffering from a lonely burden into a shared human experience. When we extend compassion outward, we also cultivate it inward, toward ourselves, nurturing patience, forgiveness, and self-love. Wisdom, on the other hand, comes from direct experience and mindful reflection. It is not just intellectual knowledge, but a lived understanding that arises through meditation, study, and life itself. It teaches us to see beyond appearances and to understand causes and conditions with clarity. This wisdom helps us navigate difficult emotions without being swept away. It allows us to respond skillfully rather than react impulsively, turning challenges into opportunities for growth. Together, compassion and wisdom form the foundation of an unshaken mind, one that moves through the world with grace, courage, and authenticity. They transform not only how we relate to ourselves, but how we engage with the world, fostering peace within and harmony around us. As we come to the close of this journey, we see how the unshaken mind is not a distant ideal, but a living reality, a way of being that anyone can cultivate through practice and intention. And with this foundation, we are ready to return to the world, calm, clear, and compassionate, carrying the peace we have found into every moment. We have traveled through the essence of what it means to live with an unshaken mind, a mind steady like a mountain, calm like a still lake amidst the storms of life. This journey is not about perfection or escape from difficulties, but about cultivating a deep, abiding presence that holds us gently through every challenge. Living with an unshaken mind means embracing life fully, with all its joys and sorrows, its certainty and unpredictability. It is waking up to the moment, moment after moment, with openness and courage. It is a choice we make again and again, to meet life not as a battleground, but as a sacred dance of change and possibility. This path invites us to cultivate mindfulness, to let go of attachments that weigh us down, and to open our hearts with compassion and wisdom. It calls us to be fully human, imperfect yet striving, grounded yet free. The beauty of this practice is that it is always available, no matter who we are or where we find ourselves. Every breath, every thought, every action can become a step toward that unshaken place within. So, as you go forward, remember that your mind can be a refuge and a source of strength. It is not something to be fixed or controlled, but something to be understood and befriended. And here's the invitation. If this message resonates with you, if you feel inspired to deepen your own journey toward an unshaken mind, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's support each other on this path of awakening. Together, we can cultivate peace in ourselves and ripple that calm into the world around us. Thank you for being here. May your mind be steady, your heart open, and your life full of compassion and wisdom.